In the flickering glow of smartphone screens across the world, a message spreads like wildfire through the digital wilderness. Videos emerge from Jerusalem, grainy footage of cracked earth and fractured pathways, accompanied by breathless narration declaring the impossible has begun. The Mount of Olives, they say, is splitting apart. The prophecy of Zechariah, dormant for 25 centuries, is awakening beneath our feet. In living rooms from Sao Paulo to Seoul, believers watch these images with trembling hands, wondering if the end of all things has finally arrived. The algorithm favors fear, and fear demands answers. But prophecy has always been a dangerous lens through which to view the present moment. Throughout history, every generation has believed itself to be the final one, interpreting earthquakes and eclipses as divine signatures written across creation. The human heart yearns for significance, for the reassurance that our struggles matter in the cosmic scheme, that history is rushing toward its climax rather than merely repeating itself. We search the headlines for horsemen, scan the skies for signs, and measure the cracks in ancient stones as if they were countdown clocks. This impulse is understandable, perhaps even necessary, but it demands something we often lack: discernment. The Mount of Olives stands as it has for millennia, a limestone ridge overlooking Jerusalem's eastern walls, its slopes crowded with the dead and the living alike. Tourists climb its paths, pausing to photograph the golden dome of the rock gleaming in the distance. Beneath their feet, the earth does indeed bear fractures, visible fissures that wind through cemetery paths and ancient walkways. These cracks are real. They exist. They can be measured and documented. But the question that echoes through both scientific journals and theological debates is not whether the mountain is fractured, but what those fractures mean. This investigation will journey deep into the heart of that question, excavating layers of geology, history, and prophecy with equal rigor. We will walk the fault lines of the Dead Sea transform, trace the seismic echoes of ancient earthquakes, and examine the words of prophets who spoke when Jerusalem was young. We will confront the uncomfortable truth that not every crack in the earth is a message from heaven, while simultaneously acknowledging that prophecy remains prophecy, waiting with infinite patience for its appointed hour. The truth, as always, lies not in what we wish to see, but in what actually is. What follows is neither a dismissal of faith nor a surrender to cynicism, but an attempt to see clearly in an age of manufactured urgency. The Mount of Olives holds secrets in its limestone bones, memories of violence and worship, of empires risen and fallen. It has felt the footsteps of kings and prophets, has witnessed the ascension of Christ and the destruction of temples. If it is truly preparing to split apart at the return of the Messiah, then that event will require no social media amplification to announce itself. Until that day arrives, we have a responsibility to truth, to examine what lies beneath the viral videos and ask the questions that fear would rather we ignore.
Before we start, I need your help. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep bringing these hidden truths to light.
The story begins not in a scientific laboratory or a theological seminary, but in the chaotic marketplace of social media, where truth and fiction blur into indistinguishable shadows. Sometime in recent months, videos began circulating through WhatsApp groups, YouTube channels, and Facebook feeds, each one presenting similar imagery with escalating urgency. A tour guide films a crack in an ancient pathway, his voice hushed with reverence or perhaps manufactured drama. A tourist captures footage of fissures near the Jewish cemetery, the caption proclaiming that Zechariah's prophecy is unfolding in real time. These clips accumulate views in the millions, shared by those hungry for meaning in uncertain times. What makes these videos compelling is their apparent authenticity. Unlike obvious fabrications or conspiracy theories built on pure speculation, these images show something undeniably real. The cracks exist. They can be visited, touched, measured with one's own hands. There is no need for elaborate CGI or photographic manipulation when the Earth itself provides the evidence. This tangible reality gives the claims a veneer of credibility, allowing them to bypass the skepticism that might greet more outlandish prophetic interpretations. The viewer sees the fractured stone and thinks, something is happening. Yet the videos share a common omission, a crucial context that transforms their meaning entirely. None of them acknowledge the mountain's documented history of instability, None reference the geological surveys conducted over decades. None mention the earthquakes that have shaken Jerusalem since ancient times, each one leaving its signature in weakened bedrock and displaced soil. The narrative presented is one of sudden, recent development, as if the mountain remained pristine and whole until this very moment when prophecy decided to manifest. This constructed timeline is essential to the claim's emotional impact. The virality of these videos speaks to something deeper than mere curiosity about geological phenomena. They spread because they offer a kind of reassurance, the promise that history is not random chaos, but a carefully scripted drama approaching its final act. For believers navigating a world that often seems devoid of transcendent meaning, the splitting mountain becomes evidence that God has not abandoned creation to entropy. It suggests that suffering and uncertainty are temporary conditions, that resolution is coming, that the broken world will soon be made whole. This psychological need fuels the video's propagation far more effectively than any algorithm. But viral spread is not the same as truth, and popularity does not equal accuracy. As these claims circulate through digital networks, they create their own reality, a shared belief that reinforces itself through repetition. People who would never accept uncorroborated claims in other areas of life suddenly become willing to embrace prophetic fulfillment based on smartphone footage and breathless narration. The Mount of Olives, indifferent to human interpretation, continues its slow geological dance, its actual condition obscured beneath layers of projection and desire. To understand what is really happening, we must strip away the narrative and examine the mountain itself. The Mount of Olives exists because of violence, not the violence of armies or empires, though it has witnessed plenty of both, but the deeper violence of tectonic forces that have shaped this land for millions of years. Beneath Jerusalem's ancient stones lies one of Earth's most significant geological features, the Dead Sea Transform, a strike-slip fault system that runs nearly the entire length of the Levant. This is not dormant geology, not the fossilized remnants of ancient processes, but an active wound in the planet's crust where the African and Arabian tectonic plates grind past each other with inexorable force. The mountain was born from this grinding, and it continues to be shaped by it. To understand the Mount of Olives, one must first understand limestone, that humble rock that forms the skeleton of Jerusalem and its surrounding hills. Limestone is sedimentary stone, formed from the compressed remains of ancient marine organisms, laid down layer by layer when this entire region rested beneath a warm, shallow sea. It is relatively soft as rocks go, porous and vulnerable to chemical weathering. When rainwater, slightly acidic from dissolved carbon dioxide, seeps into limestone, it slowly dissolves the stone, creating networks of caves and weakening the rock's internal structure. Over centuries and millennia, this process can hollow out entire sections of bedrock, leaving surfaces that appear solid but rest above hidden voids. The Mount of Olives is not a single solid mass, but a complex structure of limestone layers, fractured by countless stresses. Ancient faults run through it like old scars, zones of weakness where the rock has been previously broken and imperfectly healed. Each earthquake that shakes the region exploits these existing weaknesses, widening old cracks and creating new ones. The process is cumulative, with each seismic event building upon the damage of previous ones, slowly fragmenting the mountain's integrity. This is not speculation but documented fact, confirmed by geological surveys and structural analyses conducted by Israeli authorities concerned with public safety. Water amplifies every vulnerability. During the rainy season, water infiltrates the mountain's fractures, dissolving limestone and carrying away dissolved minerals. In winter, water that has seeped into cracks can freeze, expanding with enough force to widen fissures. Over decades, small cracks become larger ones, and larger cracks eventually manifest as visible surface features. This process requires no supernatural intervention, no prophetic fulfillment, merely time and the patient work of chemistry and physics. The mountain is not being split by divine command, but slowly fragmented by the same forces that shape every limestone formation on Earth. Yet even without these natural processes, the Mount of Olives would face challenges from human activity. For more than 2,000 years, people have carved into this mountain, building structures, excavating burial sites, and creating the vast Jewish cemetery that now covers much of its western slope. Every tomb excavation disturbs the bedrock. Every road cut through the mountain alters water drainage patterns. The cumulative weight of human modification, combined with natural geological vulnerability, has left certain areas genuinely unstable. Israeli authorities have issued warnings about these zones, not because of prophetic concerns, but because of simple engineering reality. The mountain, under siege from both nature and humanity, is indeed fractured, but it has been fracturing for a very long time. The Earth remembers what humans forget. Buried in the geological record of the Mount of Olives and surrounding regions lies evidence of catastrophic violence. Earthquakes so powerful, they reshaped the landscape and toppled the works of civilizations. These events are not myth or religious parable, but documented historical facts, confirmed through archaeological excavation, written records, and seismological analysis. The mountain bears the accumulated scars of these disasters, each one contributing to the fractures we see today. To understand the present condition of the Mount of Olives, we must excavate these seismic memories, trace the timeline of destruction written in displaced stones and broken bedrock. The most devastating earthquake in the region's historical record struck in 749 CE, an event so powerful it earned its own name, the Great Levantine Earthquake. Contemporary chronicles describe cities collapsing across the region, from Damascus to Jerusalem. Archaeological excavations have revealed the signature of this disaster in virtually every significant site from the period. Walls toppled in uniform directions, buildings abandoned suddenly, and thick layers of destruction debris. In Jerusalem, excavations on the eastern slopes near the Mount of Olives have uncovered evidence of massive structural failures consistent with this event, including collapsed retaining walls and fractured bedrock. This was not a minor tremor, but a civilization-altering catastrophe. 3 centuries later, in 1033 CE, another major earthquake struck the region. Medieval sources describe widespread destruction in Jerusalem, with buildings reduced to rubble and the population fleeing in terror. Modern seismological analysis suggests this earthquake originated along the same fault system, potentially reaching a magnitude of 7.0 or higher. Crucially for our investigation, this earthquake struck an area already weakened by previous seismic events. The Mount of Olives, fractured by the 749 earthquake, was fractured again, old cracks widening and new ones forming. The principle of cumulative damage is key. Each earthquake does not merely create its own damage, but amplifies the vulnerability created by previous events. In more recent times, the 1927 earthquake provides our most thoroughly documented case study. With its epicenter near Jericho, this earthquake struck during the British Mandate period, when modern engineering and documentation practices were in place. British engineers surveyed the damage extensively, producing detailed reports that remain available today. These documents describe significant ground cracking and landslides in eastern Jerusalem, with particular attention paid to the Mount of Olives, where instability threatened structures and roadways. Photographs from the period show fissures and ground deformation remarkably similar to those appearing in today's viral videos. The mountain was cracking then, just as it appears to be cracking now. Between these major events lie countless smaller earthquakes, tremors that individually caused minimal damage but collectively contributed to the mountain's deterioration. Seismologists recognize that earthquake damage is not binary, not a simple matter of structures either surviving intact or collapsing completely. Instead, each seismic event introduces microfractures, weakens bonds within rock, and creates zones of reduced cohesion. Over centuries, these micro-damages accumulate, transforming solid rock into something more fragile, more prone to visible cracking, even without additional major seismic events. The Mount of Olives we see today is not unchanged since biblical times, but a palimpsest of geological trauma, each layer of damage visible to those who know how to read the stone. Long before modern tourists climbed its slopes with cameras ready, the Mount of Olives bore the weight of human ambition and sorrow. For more than 2 millennia, this mountain has been carved, built upon, and transformed by successive generations who saw in its stone both opportunity and sacred significance. Every action taken upon the mountain has consequences, visible and invisible, that accumulate across time. When we examine the fractures in the Mount of Olives today, we are not merely looking at geological processes, but at the layered impact of human history itself, written in displaced earth and weakened bedrock. The most visible human modification is the vast Jewish cemetery that blankets much of the mountain's western slope, one of the oldest and largest Jewish burial grounds in the world. The practice of burial here is rooted in eschatological hope, the belief that when the Messiah comes, those buried on the Mount of Olives will be first to rise. This conviction has driven families for generations to secure burial plots on these slopes, resulting in a density of graves that defies easy comprehension. More than 150,000 burial sites crowd the hillside, many of them requiring excavation into the mountain's limestone bedrock. Each grave represents a disruption of the geological structure, a void carved into stone, weakening the integrity of the surrounding rock. But the cemetery is only the most obvious intervention. Throughout history, the mount has been fortified, besieged, and built upon repeatedly. Roman legions camped here during the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, constructing temporary fortifications and altering the landscape for military advantage. Byzantine Christians built churches and monasteries on its slopes, some of which still stand, their foundations cutting deep into the mountain's stone. Ottoman-era construction added layers of human infrastructure, followed by modern roads, tourist facilities, and drainage systems. Each of these interventions required cutting into rock, redirecting water flow, and redistributing the mountain's weight in ways that its natural structure was never designed to accommodate. Water management, or the lack thereof, compounds these structural challenges. In its natural state, rainwater would flow down the mountain slopes following paths established over millennia, infiltrating the stone in predictable patterns. But human construction has disrupted these ancient drainage patterns, concentrating water flow in some areas while cutting it off in others. Roads act as barriers, redirecting water into places where it accelerates erosion. Buildings create impermeable surfaces that force water to find new paths through the bedrock, often following and widening existing fractures. The mountain's hydrological system, evolved over geological time, has been chaotically reorganized by human activity, with consequences that manifest as surface cracking and subsurface instability. The sheer volume of foot traffic adds its own subtle but persistent stress. Thousands of tourists, pilgrims, and locals traverse the Mount of Olives daily, following pathways that wind between graves and viewpoints. Each footstep represents a tiny impact, but accumulated over years and decades, this constant pressure contributes to the gradual compaction and displacement of soil and broken stone. In areas where pathways cross zones of geological weakness, this traffic can accelerate the widening of existing cracks, transforming invisible subsurface fractures into visible surface features. The mountain, patient but not invincible, responds to this pressure the only way it can, by slowly coming apart. Modern Israeli authorities have not ignored these concerns. Engineering reports and safety assessments have identified specific zones of the Mount of Olives as structurally compromised, requiring monitoring and, in some cases, restricted access. These warnings are not motivated by religious considerations or prophetic speculation, but by straightforward concerns about public safety. Retaining walls show signs of stress, pathways develop dangerous depressions, and, in extreme cases, small collapses occur. These interventions confirm what geological analysis already tells us. The Mount of Olives is indeed fractured and unstable in places, but this instability is the predictable result of natural geology combined with intensive human use. The mountain is not preparing for prophecy, it is simply bearing the accumulated weight of history. In an age where scientific institutions monitor everything from atmospheric carbon levels to the minute vibrations of distant galaxies, one might expect that an extraordinary geological event on the Mount of Olives would trigger immediate official response. If the mountain were truly beginning to split apart in fulfillment of ancient prophecy, surely Israeli geological surveys, seismological institutes, and international monitoring stations would be issuing alerts, publishing emergency studies, and implementing evacuation procedures. The absence of such response is itself a crucial piece of evidence, a silence that speaks louder than any viral video narration. no alarms are sounding in the offices of Israeli seismologists because there is no anomalous event to sound alarms about. The Israel Geological Survey, the nation's primary authority on such matters, has issued no statements indicating unusual seismic activity or structural changes on the Mount of Olives. Their ongoing monitoring of the region, which includes regular assessment of the Dead Sea Transform fault system, shows normal background seismicity consistent with the area's geological character. Small earthquakes occur regularly along this fault system, as they have for millennia, but none suggest the imminent catastrophic splitting of any mountain. The data shows a geologically active region behaving exactly as such regions behave, with no indication of extraordinary or accelerating processes that would herald prophetic fulfillment. Similarly, structural engineers and municipal authorities responsible for public safety in Jerusalem have not declared emergency conditions on the Mount of Olives. While they have indeed issued warnings about specific unstable areas, these are routine safety measures for a site with known geological vulnerabilities and intensive human use. The warnings are not new, having been updated and reissued periodically over years as monitoring continues. They recommend caution in certain areas, restrict access to zones with active instability, and require structural reinforcement for some pathways and retaining walls. These are the ordinary precautions of responsible governance, not emergency responses to unprecedented geological events. International seismological networks, which monitor seismic activity globally with extraordinary precision, have detected no unusual patterns centered on Jerusalem or the Mount of Olives. Modern seismographs can detect ground movements measured in microns, capable of registering earthquakes occurring halfway around the world. If the Mount of Olives were experiencing the kind of tectonic stress required to actually split the mountain, these instruments would register clear signals: unusual microseismicity, ground deformation detectable by GPS and satellite interferometry, changes in groundwater levels, and other precursor phenomena that typically precede major tectonic events. The data shows none of this. The mountain is seismically unremarkable. This scientific silence does not prove that the prophecy of Zechariah will never be fulfilled. What it demonstrates conclusively is that the prophecy is not being fulfilled now, that the current fractures on the Mount of Olives do not represent the beginning of the prophesied event. The distinction is crucial. Prophecy may indeed be true and awaiting its appointed hour, but that hour is not marked by the gradual geological processes currently visible on the mountain. When the prophesied splitting occurs, if it occurs, it will not be a subtle event requiring viral videos to bring it to public attention. It will be unmistakable, demanding no interpretation, visible to scientific instruments and human eyes alike. Until that moment arrives, the cracks on the Mount of Olives remain what they have always been: the ordinary wounds of time, geology, and human history. The Mount of Olives does not earn its significance from geological grandeur. It stands neither particularly tall nor impressively vast when measured against the world's true mountains. Its limestone ridges would be unremarkable, easily overlooked, if not for one defining characteristic that elevates it above mere physical geography. It is woven into the fabric of biblical narrative with a density that few locations on Earth can claim. Every slope, every path, every stone carries the weight of sacred memory, transforming simple geography into something approaching holy ground. To understand why fractures on this particular mountain generate such intense speculation, we must first understand what this mountain means to those who see it through the lens of Scripture. The mount rises east of Jerusalem's Old City, separated from the Temple Mount by the narrow Kidron Valley, a ravine that has witnessed countless processions between the sacred and the profane. From its summit, one gains a complete view of the city, a panorama that encompasses the Golden Dome of the Rock, the Western Wall, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This positioning is not coincidental but strategic, both militarily and spiritually. Throughout history, whoever controlled the Mount of Olives held the high ground over Jerusalem, a geographical advantage that made it the natural staging area for siege armies. But more significantly for our purposes, this vantage point made it the perfect location for prophetic observation, a place from which to look upon Jerusalem and speak of its destiny. In the Hebrew Scriptures, the mount appears at moments of profound spiritual crisis. King David, fleeing his own son's rebellion, ascends the Mount of Olives weeping, his head covered in shame and grief. The text describes him climbing barefoot, a posture of humiliation before God, while below him the city he unified spirals into civil war. This episode forever marks the mountain as a place of sorrow and supplication, where even kings become refugees seeking divine mercy. The prophet Ezekiel later describes the glory of God departing from the temple and resting on the mountain east of the city, traditionally identified as the Mount of Olives. This departure is devastating in its implications, God abandoning his dwelling place, leaving through the eastern gate to rest on the mount before departing entirely. The New Testament intensifies the mountain's significance further. Jesus spent his final week teaching on its slopes, delivering his discourse on the end times while overlooking the temple that would be destroyed within a generation. He retreated there nightly when the city became too dangerous, finding refuge in Gethsemane's olive groves, where he would ultimately be betrayed and arrested. The garden's name itself, Gethsemane, means oil press, a reminder that this mount was not merely symbolic landscape, but working agricultural land, its olives pressed for oil that lit temple lamps. After his resurrection, Jesus led his disciples to the mount one final time, ascending to heaven from its slopes while angels promised his return in the same manner. This layered history creates an almost unbearable density of meaning. The Mount of Olives functions in Scripture not as mere setting, but as theological location, a place where heaven and earth intersect with peculiar intensity. It is the mountain of departure and promised return, of divine presence withdrawing and divine presence restored. When Zechariah prophesies that God's feet will stand upon the Mount of Olives, causing it to split, he is not selecting a random geographical feature, but the exact location already laden with eschatological significance. The mountain already marked God's departure in Ezekiel. Zechariah describes it as the point of return. This is why believers watching videos of cracks react with such visceral intensity. They are not merely seeing damaged stone, but potentially witnessing the first tremors of a cosmic narrative reaching its climax on ground already consecrated by millennia of sacred history. Zechariah wrote in the shadow of trauma, his words emerging from a community struggling to rebuild not just physical structures, but shattered identity. The Jewish people had returned from Babylonian exile to find Jerusalem in ruins, the temple a memory, and their national coherence fragmented across generations and geography. In this context of profound dislocation, Zechariah receives visions that peer beyond immediate circumstances into a future when God would finally and definitively intervene in human history. The book's final chapters, 12 through 14, abandon the symbolic complexity of earlier visions in favor of stark, almost brutal clarity about what is coming. These are not parables requiring interpretation, but direct prophetic declarations about the end of the age. Chapter 14 opens with Jerusalem under siege, the city taken, houses plundered, women raped, and half the population driven into exile. The description is merciless in its detail, refusing to sanitize the horror of military conquest. This is not symbolic oppression, but literal violence, the kind that has indeed befallen Jerusalem repeatedly throughout history. Yet Zechariah insists this final siege will differ from all previous ones because of what happens next. The text declares, "Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations, as he fights on a day of battle." The verb "go out" is critical here, suggesting movement, divine deployment, God physically entering the theater of war. What follows is the verse that concerns us. On that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west, forming a great valley, with half of the mountain moving north and half moving south. The language resists symbolic interpretation. Zechariah specifies exact geographical location, cardinal directions, and physical outcomes. This is not the mountain seeming to split or metaphorically dividing, but actually physically fracturing into two masses that relocate north and south, creating a valley where solid mountain once stood. The precision of the description demands a correspondingly precise fulfillment. The immediate context makes clear this is not gradual geological process, but sudden divine intervention. The splitting occurs on that day, the same day God's feet touch the mountain, simultaneously with Jerusalem's deliverance from siege. The sequence is crucial. Feet touch stone, stone splits, valley forms. People flee through the newly created passage. There is no time for erosion, no gradual widening of existing fissures, no centuries-long geological drama. The event is instantaneous and unmistakable, requiring no interpretation or explanation. Those present will not debate whether the prophecy is being fulfilled. They will experience it as obvious, inescapable reality. Zechariah continues describing the aftermath: living waters flowing from Jerusalem, God becoming king over all the earth, and the land being transformed into a plain while Jerusalem remains elevated. These consequences flow directly from the mountains splitting, part of a comprehensive transformation of both geography and governance. The prophecy does not present the split mountain as an isolated sign pointing toward future fulfillment, but as the opening movement of the final act itself. When the mountain splits, history as we know it is ending, not merely approaching its end. This is why theological interpreters, whether Jewish or Christian, have consistently understood Zechariah 14 as describing events yet future, not as a process unfolding gradually through observable stages. The prophecy does not invite us to watch for preliminary signs, but to await an event that will require no interpretation when it arrives. Walk among the graves that crowd the western slope of the Mount of Olives, and you are walking through a cemetery unlike any other on earth. The stones lean at angles suggesting great age, some inscriptions worn illegible by centuries of wind and rain, others sharp and recent. The sheer density of burial is overwhelming. Graves pressed against graves, generations layered upon generations, all oriented toward Jerusalem. This is not merely a burial ground, but a statement of theological conviction written in stone and bone, a collective bet placed by thousands of families across centuries that this particular mountain will be the epicenter of resurrection. The cemetery exists because of Zechariah's prophecy, its very presence a testament to how literally the Jewish tradition has always interpreted the text. The logic underlying this practice is straightforward. If the Messiah will appear on the Mount of Olives, and if the resurrection of the dead will commence at his arrival, then proximity to that epicenter provides spiritual advantage. This is not superstition, but a form of practical eschatology, an attempt to position oneself as favorably as possible for the world to come. Rabbinical tradition holds that the resurrection will begin at the Mount of Olives and proceed westward toward the Temple Mount, meaning those buried here will rise first, will be first to see the Messiah, first to enter the renewed Jerusalem. For families who could afford it, securing a plot on these slopes became an essential act of faith. This practice stretches back at least to Second Temple times, meaning the mountain has served as a burial ground for over 2,000 years. Some graves date to the period when Jesus walked these same slopes, when the temple still stood, and Roman legions had not yet reduced the city to rubble. Through all the subsequent disasters, Roman destruction, Byzantine reconstruction, Muslim conquest, Crusader occupation, Ottoman rule, and modern conflicts, the cemetery persisted, growing ever more crowded. Each generation added its dead to the mountain, staking their claim to this geography of hope, this real estate of the world to come. The theological conviction underlying this practice reveals how Jewish interpretation has always understood Zechariah 14. The prophecy is not read as metaphor or spiritual allegory, but as literal description of a literal event at a literal location. The Messiah will physically stand on this physical mountain. His feet, actual feet, will make contact with actual stone. The mountain will physically divide, not symbolically or spiritually, but with actual rock displacing into actual valleys. This literalism is not fundamentalist innovation, but ancient Jewish expectation, so deeply held that families invested substantial resources to ensure their dead occupied this ground when the moment arrives. Consequently, from a traditional Jewish perspective, current fractures on the Mount of Olives carry no prophetic significance whatsoever. The tradition does not expect gradual fulfillment, does not look for preliminary signs or progressive splitting. It awaits a single, unmistakable event that will be obvious to all observers simultaneously. The Messiah will come, the mountain will split, the dead will rise, not as process, but as arrival. Until that moment, the graves wait in their crowded ranks, oriented toward Jerusalem, while above them tourists photograph cracks and speculate about prophecy. The dead, one imagines, are more patient than the living, content to wait for the real event rather than mistaking ordinary geology for divine intervention. For Christianity, the Mount of Olives carries additional weight, transformed from site of expectation into site of memory and promise combined. This is where Jesus wept over Jerusalem, where he delivered his apocalyptic discourse, where he sweat drops of blood in agonized prayer. This is where Judas betrayed him with a kiss, where Roman soldiers bound his hands, where his earthly ministry effectively ended before the trials and crucifixion. And most significantly for eschatological interpretation, this is where he ascended into heaven 40 days after resurrection, his physical body rising until clouds obscured him from the watching disciples. The location of departure becomes, in Christian theology, the promised location of return. The book of Acts records that as the disciples stood gazing upward at the ascending Christ, two angels appeared and delivered a message that has shaped Christian eschatology ever since. This same Jesus, who has been taken from you into heaven, will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven. The promise is specific in its details. The same Jesus, not a symbol, not a spiritual principle, but the same person with the same glorified body, will come back, not metaphorically or in spiritual influence, but physically returning. In the same way, ascending visibly, descending visibly. The location is implicit but clear. He departed from the Mount of Olives and will return to the Mount of Olives. This connection between ascension and second coming provides the interpretive key for how Christianity reads Zechariah 14. When the prophet declares that God's feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, Christian theology identifies those feet as belonging to the risen, glorified Christ. The prophecy is not about some abstract divine appearance, but about Jesus of Nazareth, crucified under Pontius Pilate, raised on the third day, and returning as he promised. The splitting of the mountain is not a sign pointing toward his coming, but a consequence of his arrival. The earth itself responding to the physical presence of its creator, returned in power and glory. Pre-tribulation eschatology, dominant in much of evangelical Christianity, places this event at a specific moment in the prophetic timeline. After the church has been raptured, after the 7-year tribulation period, at the climax when armies gather against Jerusalem in the campaign of Armageddon. Christ returns not to a world at peace, but to a world in final rebellion, nations united in opposition to God and his people. He descends to the Mount of Olives. His feet make contact with the stone, and the mountain splits, not gradually, not as culmination of geological process, but instantaneously in response to his presence. This is the moment of intervention, when history's trajectory is interrupted by eternity breaking through. From this theological perspective, watching for current fractures to widen as prophetic fulfillment fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the event predicted. The prophecy does not describe a process that believers should monitor, but a singular moment that will require no interpretation when it occurs. Christ's return will not be ambiguous, will not depend on viral videos or debatable evidence. It will be, as Jesus himself declared, like lightning flashing from east to west, visible to all, undeniable in its reality. The mountain will not gradually crack under geological pressure, but will split under the weight of divine presence, and every eye will see it. Until that moment arrives, current cracks remain what they have always been, the ordinary fractures of an old mountain slowly yielding to time and pressure, bearing witness not to prophecy, but to entropy. Imagine for a moment attempting to explain the prophesied splitting of the Mount of Olives through natural geological mechanisms. You would need a process capable of dividing a mountain precisely along an east-west axis, displacing the two resulting masses north and south respectively, and creating a stable valley in between, all instantaneously, or at least rapidly enough to serve as escape route for fleeing populations. You would need this process to occur on command, triggered by specific historical circumstances at the exact moment of military crisis. You would need geology to cooperate with prophecy, natural law to bend to narrative necessity. The more clearly one envisions the actual physical requirements, the more obvious it becomes that no known natural process can accomplish this. Earthquakes, the most powerful geological force capable of rapid landscape modification, do not work with this kind of precision. They release stress accumulated in rock over decades or centuries, producing shaking that radiates from a focal point. The ground ruptures along existing fault lines or creates new fractures following paths of least resistance through the rock. The result is invariably chaotic, irregular fissures, unpredictable displacement, collapsed structures, and unstable terrain. Earthquakes destroy, they do not construct. They shatter mountains, they do not split them cleanly into functional valleys. The idea that seismic activity could produce the geometrically precise, directionally consistent, immediately traversable result described in Zechariah stretches credulity beyond breaking. Volcanic activity offers no better explanation. While volcanic forces can certainly alter landscapes dramatically, the Mount of Olives sits nowhere near any volcanic system. The region's geology is tectonic, not volcanic, with no magma chambers, no volcanic history, and no plausible mechanism for sudden volcanic emergence. Even if such forces existed, volcanic events produce mountains, cones, calderas, lava fields, not cleanly divided valleys. Volcanic activity is spectacular and destructive, but it does not split existing mountains along specified axes while leaving the surrounding terrain functional. Gradual erosion, the process actually responsible for much of the current cracking, operates on timescales completely incompatible with prophetic narrative. Limestone dissolves and fractures over centuries and millennia, not in response to specific historical moments. Water infiltration, freeze-thaw cycles, and chemical weathering are powerful shapers of landscape, but they lack agency, purpose, or timing. They cannot wait for the appropriate moment to fulfill prophecy. The processes currently affecting the Mount of Olives will continue their slow work for thousands of years to come, producing ever more dramatic fractures, but never the clean, directional, purposeful split that Zechariah describes. This impossibility is not weakness in the prophecy, but confirmation of its supernatural character. Zechariah is not predicting an unusual but natural geological event that future observers might mistake for divine intervention. He is describing something that cannot happen naturally, that requires suspension or overruling of natural law, that demands divine action. When the mountain splits, if it splits as prophesied, geology will not explain it. No seismologist will write papers detailing the natural mechanisms involved. The event will be its own evidence, requiring no interpretation, offering no natural explanation. This is precisely why current fractures, regardless of how dramatic they appear in viral videos, cannot represent prophetic fulfillment. They have natural explanations, adequate causes in geology and human activity. The prophesied event, when it comes, will have only one adequate explanation: the presence of God. Throughout history, the human hunger for meaning has generated an endless stream of false signs, premature declarations that the end is upon us. Every generation discovers its own apocalypse in the headlines, interpreting current events through the lens of ancient prophecy until the pattern becomes clear. We are masters at seeing what we wish to see, experts at transforming the ordinary into the extraordinary when our theology demands it. The viral videos of cracks on the Mount of Olives are merely the latest iteration of this ancient tendency, but understanding why these false signs proliferate requires examining the psychological and theological architecture that makes them so compelling and so persistent. The first element of this architecture is what we might call interpretive urgency, the conviction that we live in uniquely significant times that demand prophetic explanation. Every age believes itself exceptional, positioned at history's climax, but our current moment intensifies this conviction through technology that makes global events immediately visible and catastrophes constantly present. Wars in distant lands stream into our pockets in real time. Natural disasters become viral content within hours. The apocalyptic imagination feeds on this information saturation, finding in every crisis confirmation that the end approaches. When believers encounter images of cracks on a mountain already laden with prophetic significance, they are primed by this interpretive urgency to see not geology, but destiny. The second element is selective attention, the cognitive bias that causes us to notice evidence supporting our beliefs while dismissing contradictory information. A believer convinced that Christ's return is imminent will watch videos of fractures on the Mount of Olives with intense focus, studying every crack, measuring every fissure, accumulating evidence of prophetic fulfillment. The same person will likely never seek out geological surveys explaining these cracks, never research the earthquake history of the region, never question why Israeli authorities are not declaring emergency conditions. Information that challenges the preferred narrative is not actively rejected, but simply never encountered, filtered out by algorithms and confirmation bias, working in concert to create echo chambers of belief. The third element is what theologians call realized eschatology gone wrong, the attempt to pull future prophecy into present fulfillment through interpretive creativity. This impulse is understandable. Waiting is difficult. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, and the promise of Christ's return can seem to recede with each passing generation. Faced with this tension, believers naturally search their circumstances for signs that the wait is ending, that prophecy is activating, that they will witness the events they have studied and anticipated. When cracks appear on the Mount of Olives, they offer tangible evidence that fulfillment is beginning, transforming abstract hope into concrete expectation. The emotional satisfaction of this transformation makes critical evaluation difficult. We want these cracks to mean something because meaning provides comfort. The fourth element is the viral mechanics of digital media, which rewards sensationalism over accuracy and emotional impact over careful analysis. A video titled "Mount of Olives Splitting, Prophecy Fulfilling" will generate vastly more engagement than one titled "Routine Geological Instability on Mount of Olives Explained." Algorithms designed to maximize user engagement inevitably amplify the former while burying the latter, creating information ecosystems where extraordinary claims circulate freely while mundane explanations struggle for attention. This is not conspiracy, but simple economics. Attention is currency, and fear, wonder, and apocalyptic urgency command premium rates. The cumulative effect of these elements is a self-reinforcing system where false signs proliferate and genuine discernment becomes nearly impossible. Believers share videos with other believers, each viewing confirming the other's interpretations, while contrary evidence never penetrates the bubble. The cracks become proof, not through rigorous analysis, but through social reinforcement, repeated assertion, and the emotional satisfaction of believing oneself witness to prophetic fulfillment. Breaking free from this architecture requires deliberate effort, a willingness to seek information that challenges preferred narratives, and the intellectual humility to admit when our desires have outrun the evidence. It requires, in short, choosing truth over comfort, even when truth means acknowledging that the wait continues and the signs we thought we saw were merely shadows cast by our own longing. Sometimes what is not present tells us more than what is. In the case of the Mount of Olives, the absence of certain responses, certain evidence, and certain consequences speaks with a clarity that drowns out all the speculation generated by viral videos. If the mountain were truly beginning the process of splitting apart in fulfillment of ancient prophecy, we would expect specific, measurable phenomena to accompany that process. The fact that none of these expected phenomena are present constitutes powerful evidence that current fractures represent ordinary geological processes rather than extraordinary prophetic fulfillment. First, there is the absence of anomalous seismic activity. Modern seismology has developed to the point where we can detect earthquake precursors, unusual swarms of microseismicity, changes in the velocity of seismic waves passing through stressed rock, ground deformation measurable at the millimeter scale through GPS and satellite radar interferometry. If the Mount of Olives were under the kind of tectonic stress required to actually split the mountain, these precursor signals would be unmistakable. Seismographs throughout the region would register unusual activity. Researchers studying the Dead Sea transform would note anomalous patterns demanding investigation. Yet the seismic record shows nothing unusual, no departure from the background activity normal for this tectonically active region. Second, there is the absence of emergency response from authorities responsible for public safety. The Israeli government employs geologists, engineers, and emergency management professionals whose job is to identify and respond to geological hazards. If professional assessment indicated that the Mount of Olives was experiencing unusual instability that could result in catastrophic collapse or rapid splitting, evacuation orders would be issued, structures would be condemned, and the area would be closed to public access. Instead, we see routine safety warnings about specific unstable zones, the kind of measured response appropriate for a site with known but manageable geological vulnerabilities. The absence of alarm from those whose careers depend on accurate threat assessment should carry far more weight than breathless narration in viral videos. Third, there is the absence of scientific publications addressing unusual geological activity on the Mount of Olives. Geologists are not shy about documenting interesting phenomena. If something extraordinary were occurring on such a historically and religiously significant site, academic papers would proliferate, researchers would compete for grant funding to study the phenomenon, and scientific conferences would feature presentations analyzing the data. A search through geological databases reveals no such publications. The scholarly silence is not evidence of conspiracy or suppression, but simple acknowledgement that nothing scientifically noteworthy is occurring. The mountain is behaving exactly as geologists would predict for limestone formation in a tectonically active region with intensive human use. Fourth, there is the absence of the prophesied consequences themselves. Zechariah describes not merely a cracking mountain, but a split mountain with displaced masses and a newly formed valley. Even if we granted that the process might unfold gradually rather than instantaneously, a concession the text does not support, but which some advocates propose, we should see measurable displacement, GPS evidence of the northern and southern sections moving apart, surveying data showing valley formation. None of this exists. The cracks, while real, show no evidence of the kind of massive displacement that would be required even for partial fulfillment of the prophecy. They are surface features, impressive perhaps to casual observers, but geologically mundane. Finally, there is the absence of consensus among believers themselves. If the evidence for prophetic fulfillment were compelling, we would expect broad agreement among those who take Zechariah 14 seriously. Instead, most respected theologians, biblical scholars, and eschatology teachers have not endorsed the interpretation that current cracks represent prophetic activation. Many have explicitly rejected this reading, pointing out the problems we have been exploring throughout this investigation. The viral videos circulate primarily among certain segments of popular Christianity prone to sensationalism, while seminaries and theological institutions remain skeptical. This pattern, extraordinary claims embraced by popular media but rejected by subject matter experts, is characteristic of false signs throughout history. The absence of expert consensus, combined with all the other absences documented above, builds a cumulative case that should give pause to anyone tempted to see prophecy in ordinary geological fractures. To declare prophetic fulfillment where none exists is not merely an intellectual error, but a spiritual hazard with real consequences for believers and the credibility of faith itself. Throughout history, premature prophetic declarations have left wreckage in their wake. Disillusioned believers whose faith collapsed when predictions failed, skeptics armed with new ammunition against religious belief, and communities fractured by debates over interpretations that time proved false. The stakes in these declarations are higher than they first appear, which is why discernment matters, and why we must resist the temptation to baptize our speculation as divine revelation. Consider the psychological impact on believers who accept that the Mount of Olives is splitting in prophetic fulfillment. They reorganize their lives around imminent expectation, making decisions that only make sense if Christ's return is immediately forthcoming. Some abandon long-term planning, seeing no point in education, career development, or retirement preparation when the world is about to end. Others withdraw from cultural and political engagement, reasoning that investing in temporal affairs is futile when eternal realities are about to break through. These are not hypothetical scenarios, but documented patterns from previous waves of apocalyptic expectation. From the Millerites of the 1840s to the prophecy teachers who declared that 1988 was the terminal generation. When the predicted fulfillment fails to materialize, when years pass and the mountain remains fractured but unsplit, disillusionment sets in. Some believers experience a faith crisis, questioning not merely the specific prophetic interpretation, but the reliability of Scripture itself. If they were wrong about this seemingly clear sign, what else might they be wrong about? The fundamentalist impulse that made them susceptible to false signs in the first place now works against them, creating an all-or-nothing mentality where one failed prediction can topple an entire structure of belief. The casualty rate among those who invest heavily in specific prophetic timelines is disturbingly high, with many eventually abandoning faith entirely rather than rebuilding on more secure foundations. For those outside the faith, premature prophetic declarations provide endless material for mockery. Skeptics compile lists of failed predictions, documentary evidence of believers who declared with absolute certainty that specific dates or signs mark the end, only to be proven wrong by the simple passage of time. Each failed prediction becomes ammunition against the credibility of Christian claims more broadly. When believers point to cracks on the Mount of Olives as evidence of prophetic fulfillment, eventually to be disappointed, they inadvertently strengthen the skeptical case that religious prophecy is merely wishful thinking, pattern-seeking behavior projected onto random events. The damage to Christian witness is real and lasting, far outliving the viral videos that sparked the speculation. Within communities of faith, these declarations create division between those who embrace the new interpretation and those who remain skeptical. Families fracture over disagreements about prophetic timelines. Churches split when leadership either endorses or rejects claims of fulfillment. Those who question the interpretation are accused of faithlessness, of denying scripture, of lacking spiritual discernment. Those who embrace it are accused of gullibility, of bringing Christianity into disrepute, of prioritizing sensationalism over careful exegesis. The unity that Christ prayed for among his followers becomes casualty to arguments over whether specific cracks in specific stones carry cosmic significance. Perhaps most seriously, premature declarations risk trivializing the actual prophecies themselves. When we repeatedly cry wolf, declaring fulfillment where none exists, we train ourselves and others to dismiss prophetic claims generally. The boy who cried wolf learned too late that false alarms have consequences. When the real wolf finally arrived, no one believed his warning. Similarly, when Christ actually returns, when the Mount of Olives actually splits, when prophecy genuinely fulfills before our eyes, will we recognize it? Or will we have become so accustomed to false signs that we mistake the real event for just another viral video, another interpretation to be debated, another claim to be skeptically evaluated? The greatest danger of premature declaration may be that it blinds us to genuine fulfillment when it finally arrives, our discernment dulled by too many disappointments, our hope exhausted by too many false dawns. If the cracks on the Mount of Olives are not prophetic signs, if current fractures represent geology rather than destiny, what then should be the posture of believers who take biblical prophecy seriously? The answer is neither skepticism that dismisses all supernatural claims nor credulity that embraces every sensational interpretation, but something more difficult, patient, informed waiting that maintains hope without manufacturing fulfillment. This waiting requires wisdom, the kind of discernment that can distinguish between genuine signs and human projection, between divine action and natural process. True wisdom begins with intellectual humility, the acknowledgement that we might be wrong in our interpretations, even when we feel certain. History is littered with confident prophetic declarations that proved embarrassingly incorrect, made by sincere believers who were absolutely convinced they had decoded the signs of their times. This track record should instill caution, a healthy skepticism toward our own interpretive certainty. When we encounter claims of prophetic fulfillment, our first instinct should not be acceptance or rejection, but investigation. What evidence supports this claim? What alternative explanations exist? What would experts in relevant fields, geology, history, biblical languages, say about this interpretation? Wisdom asks questions before reaching conclusions. Second, wisdom requires respecting the actual content of prophetic texts, rather than forcing them to conform to our expectations or current events. Zechariah 14 describes a specific sequence of events: siege, divine intervention, physical presence on the mount, instantaneous splitting, and immediate consequences. To take the text seriously means allowing it to mean what it says, rather than reinterpreting it to fit observable phenomena that don't match the description. If the prophecy describes sudden splitting at Christ's return, then gradual cracking over centuries cannot represent fulfillment, no matter how much we wish to see our generation as the climactic one. Wisdom submits to the text rather than forcing the text to submit to our timeline. Third, wisdom maintains hope without demanding premature realization. Christian faith includes confident expectation of Christ's return. This is not optional but central to biblical teaching. The New Testament repeatedly exhorts believers to watch, to be ready, to live in light of coming judgment and restoration. But watching is not the same as constantly declaring that every unusual event signals imminent fulfillment. We can maintain genuine apocalyptic hope, the conviction that history is moving toward divine resolution, without needing to identify that resolution in every earthquake, political crisis, or geological fracture. The waiting is part of the test, the discipline of maintaining faith when fulfillment delays, of keeping lamps lit through long darkness. Fourth, wisdom engages with reality as it is rather than as we wish it to be. The Mount of Olives is fractured. This is fact. The fractures have natural explanations. This too is fact. No scientific evidence suggests extraordinary geological activity. Fact again. To embrace these facts is not to abandon faith, but to honor truth, recognizing that God is not threatened by honest investigation. If we feel that acknowledging natural explanations somehow weakens our faith or diminishes biblical prophecy, we reveal a faith too fragile for the real world. Robust faith can hold together multiple truths. The prophecy is true and awaits fulfillment, and the current cracks are geologically mundane. These statements do not contradict but complement each other. Finally, wisdom redirects energy from sign-seeking to faithfulness in the present. Jesus criticized his contemporaries for demanding signs while missing the significance of what was already happening before their eyes. The same temptation exists today. We can become so focused on decoding prophetic timelines, measuring cracks, and debating interpretations that we neglect the clear biblical mandates to love our neighbors, pursue justice, share the gospel, and live as citizens of a coming kingdom. The irony is that those most obsessed with watching for Christ's return often have the least energy for the work he commanded us to do while waiting. Wisdom recognizes that our job is not to manufacture fulfillment or force prophecy's hand, but to occupy faithfully until he comes, whenever that may be. The cracks on the Mount of Olives, whether prophetic or mundane, change nothing about our core calling. We wait, we watch, but we do so while working, serving, loving, and living as those who know the end of the story, even if we don't know its timing. One day, if biblical prophecy is to be trusted, the Mount of Olives will split. Not gradually, not through accumulation of geological stress, not as the culmination of centuries of erosion and earthquake damage, but suddenly, decisively, unmistakably. When that day comes, there will be no need for viral videos to spread the news, no requirement for interpretive debates to determine whether prophecy has been fulfilled. The event will announce itself with a clarity that transcends all ambiguity, visible to every eye, undeniable to every observer, requiring no explanation because its meaning will be self-evident. This is the character of biblical prophecy when it truly fulfills. Not subtle signs requiring expert interpretation, but overwhelming reality that demands response. Imagine that moment. Not the gradual widening of existing fractures, but the sudden complete division of a mountain along an east-west axis, two massive sections of limestone displacing north and south, a valley forming where solid ground existed moments before. Imagine the sound, not the quiet settling of stressed stone, but the thunderous roar of millions of tons of rock in motion, a geological impossibility made reality by the weight of divine presence. Imagine the sight, not from a tourist's smartphone, but from the midst of crisis as armies surrounding Jerusalem suddenly face terrain transformed, their strategic positions rendered irrelevant by radically altered geography. This is the event Zechariah describes, and it bears no resemblance to the modest cracks currently visible on the mountain slopes. When that day arrives, scientific instruments will capture data unlike anything in the geological record. Seismographs will register not gradual stress release, but instantaneous displacement. Satellite imagery will document the before and after, providing evidence of transformation that defies natural explanation. Geologists will publish papers not explaining the event through known mechanisms, but documenting an anomaly that demands new categories, that pushes the boundaries of what natural law can accommodate. Or perhaps more likely, they will simply fall silent, confronted with evidence that transcends their discipline's ability to explain, pointing beyond material causation to something immaterial, someone immaterial, acting with sovereign authority over creation. When that day arrives, believers will not need to defend their faith against skeptical objections or explain away apparent contradictions. The mountain itself will testify, its fractured state declaring what words cannot adequately convey, that the God who spoke through prophets in ancient times has acted decisively in human history, that promises made centuries ago have found fulfillment, that reality is larger than materialist philosophy allows. Skeptics will face a choice not between competing interpretations, but between accepting obvious truth and denying their own senses. Some will believe, recognizing in the split mountain the hand of the God they previously dismissed. Others will seek alternative explanations, manufacturing increasingly implausible natural scenarios rather than acknowledging supernatural intervention. But none will be able to claim the evidence is ambiguous or requires sophisticated analysis to evaluate. Until that day arrives, our responsibility is clear. Resist the temptation to manufacture fulfillment where none exists, maintain hope without demanding premature realization, and live faithfully regardless of prophetic timelines. The current fractures on the Mount of Olives, real though they are, remain what they have always been: the accumulated wounds of time, geology, and human history. They testify not to prophecy activating, but to a mountain slowly yielding to forces that have shaped it for millennia. This is not the fulfillment Zechariah described, but the ordinary groaning of creation waiting for redemption, waiting for the day when Christ returns and all things are made new. When the mountain truly splits, you will know. Every tongue will confess, every knee will bow, and the cracks we thought were so significant will be revealed as the minor fractures they always were, preparatory notes in a symphony whose main theme is still to come. The earth itself will cry out, not through gradual geological process, but through sudden transformation that announces the king has returned, that waiting is over, that prophecy has moved from promise to fulfillment. Until then, we watch, we wait, but we do so with eyes open to truth rather than closed by wishful thinking, with faith grounded in what Scripture actually says rather than what viral videos claim it means. The mountain stands, fractured but unbroken, neither confirming nor denying our hopes, simply enduring as it has for ages, waiting like all creation for the footsteps that will finally split it apart and usher in the age to come.